RMIT University respectfully recognises elders past, present and future. So in this Business and Human Rights Centre briefing on modern slavery in the meat production industry, our guest speakers will profile the working conditions of meat workers in Australia and the risks of modern slavery, assess the modern slavery statements of Australia's biggest procurers and producers of meat products, and advise how Australian business can better address modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chains. Just a few preliminary things to explain. BRIGHT is the Business and Human Rights Centre at RMIT University, which conducts research, training and consultancies regarding business impacts on human rights. The Work in Transition theme of BRIGHT, which sponsors this seminar, is a group of researchers led by Dr. Darren Snell, examining the transformation of work through technology, climate change and other forces, and identifying pathways towards just transitions and decent work for all. In terms of how we'll run the session, I'm going to introduce the guest speakers in a moment, who are each going to speak for about 15 minutes. Can you please mute yourselves during this Zoom session? Please do feel free. We encourage you to post questions in the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A. And we've allowed plenty of time for Q&A after we hear from the speakers. So the panel of speakers, firstly, is Patricia Fernandez, Secretary Treasurer of the Australasian Meat Industry Employees Union New South Wales branch. The long background originally as a meat worker, as a process worker at Ingham's at Hoxton Park, and then a long career with the union as an organiser since 1992, then becoming Secretary Treasurer. And Patricia is going to speak about the working conditions commonly experienced by meat industry employees in Australia. Our second speaker is Professor Shelley Marshall, who's stepping in for Emma Moolchand. Emma's the lead author on the Where's the Beef report, which we're launching today. Shelley is one of its co-authors. And Shelley has published and advised on corporate accountability for 25 years, focusing on the labour conditions of vulnerable workers and modern slavery. Her research has informed labour law reform in several countries, including Thailand, and the policies of the International Labour Organization. And Shelley was the founding director of BRIGHT, recently stepped aside from that position, and was also awarded an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellowship in 2020. And Shelley's going to describe the main findings of the report that's being launched today. So just a few brief comments from me now to set the scene for today's discussion. 7 years ago, I chaired the Victorian Government inquiry into the labour hire industry and insecure work. And during that inquiry, I found extensive evidence of non-compliance with Australia's workplace laws, especially in three industries: horticulture, so fresh food production, contract cleaning, and the meat industry. And I'm sure that the stories I heard of appalling working conditions experienced by meat workers will be reflected in what Patricia and Shelley have to tell us today. At the time I was doing the inquiry and the evidence I heard, large meat processing plants mainly engaged workers through labour hire agencies, with a high proportion of these workers recruited offshore in countries like Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And those workers were then brought to Australia mainly on working holiday visas, and then placed in a meatworks in a regional area on a series of successive 6-month contracts up to the limit, 2-year limit, I think was the then applicable period for a working holiday visa. But it's a far cry from what we think of in terms of backpackers coming to Australia to enjoy a rich cultural experience. These workers were housed in substandard accommodation, ripped off through illegal deductions from their wages, if not outright underpayment, and subject to serious safety risks through inadequate training. And I'm sure Patricia will speak to the dangerous nature of work in this industry. Some companies engaged meat workers through labour hire agencies who purported not even to employ them. They were required to provide ABNs and treated as independent contractors with no employment rights. On no view could it seriously be considered that these workers were entrepreneurs running their own independent businesses. The licensing scheme that I recommended to ensure labour hire providers meet their obligations under workplace tax, migration and health and safety laws was introduced by the Victorian government in 2018. Queensland, South Australia and the Northern Territory, the ACT have similar licensing schemes, and the Albanese government plans to introduce a national labour hire licensing scheme next year. So I'll be interested to hear if Patricia has any views on whether this form of licensing has helped, has had any impact on improving working conditions in the meat industry. And we're going to hear from Shelley about the effectiveness of a different regulatory approach to countering exploitation, and that is modern slavery reporting under the Modern Slavery Act, which came into effect in Australia a few years ago. So with those preliminary remarks to set the scene, I'll now ask Patricia to talk to us about her experience and observations of working conditions for workers in the meat industry. Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Anthony. And I reiterate that we are all meeting on lands of the First Nations people, and encourage all of you to look at ensuring that you support the voice going forward. It's about the right time to give people a voice after they've been in this country for over 65,000 years. I am sorry, I'm very, very nasal. I've got a really bad head cold. So if I sound a bit funny, I'm really sorry about that. I'll try and keep my remarks low so that there's plenty of questions. I know people like to ask questions about the meat industry, and it's not often you get to ask somebody that's from the inside pretty much about how the industry works. And, you know, I did come into the industry. I've been in the industry for 40 years or thereabouts. I came into the industry to put myself through university, and then, you know, through some disputation in the workplace, the union offered me a job, and I've been with them ever since. I'm one of those rare union officials that has only stayed with the same union. I personally love the meat industry. Wherever I go, even if I'm on holidays overseas, I'm always looking in the industry, looking at butcher shops and small goods manufacturers. I have a passion for the industry. However, I have seen over my time a huge change in the industry, and it's all been as a result, in my opinion, has been as a result of the influx of precarious employment practices in our industry. You know, it all started with initially with 457 visas, which were the skilled migration visas. You know, and if you think about what constitutes a skill, yes, in the meat industry, we are a trade, especially at the slaughtering trade and boning trade and slicer trade. But the reality is those visas were predominantly left for people who were academics or doctors, nurses. It was never meant for the meat industry. And all of a sudden we started seeing the influx of 457 visas, and with 457 visas came their partners and their families, and those people were employed. Although the 457 visas were employed under a labour agreement that was done with the union, the reality was that the secondary visa holders were open to exploitation. From that, then we saw the bringing in of people from initially, like we've seen them from everywhere, Brazil, Taiwan, China, the Philippines, and just about everywhere else. And more recently, we've seen them coming in from the Pacific Islands. On top of that, the labour hire industry has put an enormous dent in labour. It's all about, in my opinion, about discombobulating the labour market. You know, when you make people insecure in their work, they're less likely to complain about their working conditions. They're less likely to get involved in bargaining disputes because they're afraid that their jobs are on the line. And this has been, in my opinion, a very calculated and well thought out scheme that has really ruined our industry. You know, you've got to think about our industry is not just red meat where we do cattle, and that we also have pigs, we also have poultry. We don't cover fish, but also fish is also one of those other industries where workers work in very precarious. Now think about going out on a boat, middle of the night, you're probably gone for a couple of weeks, you know. So, you know, providing food is always precarious. So, you know, working in the meat industry, you know, if you think about slaughtering a 400 or 500 kilo animal, you know, it takes a lot of skill. It also takes a lot of physical work to do so. And our industry prided itself on what was known as tally systems. Ironically, the tally system was introduced by employers. It wasn't something that the union introduced. We would have, you know, because it was a really good thing to do. And that was, a tally system was about paying piece rates. So the workers agreed to reach a minimum, what was known as a minimum tally. And for that, they got a certain wage, and anything above that to a maximum tally, they got penalties for. It became so efficient that the workers were finishing work 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, even though they were processing everything that was put up to them. For reasons best known to some employers, they decided that that was just too efficient, and they didn't like that because they were thinking, well, why aren't we, you know, why are we paying people to just work till 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock when we could have them here till 3 o'clock? That in itself, you know, it's a very, very physical job to work in our industry. It took out, you know, like people were just like, we can't do this for 8 hours, you know, like it's so taxing on the body. So then, you know, then the employers started, you know, the conditions of employment diminished. So therefore people just, you know, so I'm not going to work in this industry unless I'm paid proper wages and the terms and conditions of employment are what they should be for the industry that we work in, excuse me. Hence then the labour hire came in, the people from overseas. And what we're seeing, like I'll give you an example. In one of the workplaces where the company basically went to China, this was reported in the, you know, this has been widely reported. They went to China and secured a contract. The Chinese said to them, yep, you can have the contract, but you've got to employ Chinese people. Yeah, unbelievable. They come into our industry, they don't have the skill, because our abattoir sector, if you think about, it's very different. You know, every country has a very different system. If you think about in Europe, the majority of animals, half of the year, are kept indoors because of the weather. We have free ranging or animals all year round. So the system is very, very different. They come with a handler, what we call a handler. That handler is at the factory with them all the time. So their command of the English language is probably zero, or even if they can speak English, they're not going to speak to us, you know, because the handler is there. You know, if we're sitting in the canteen, even if we stand up and talk to them, the handler is the one who translates, you know, who knows what him or her say. We can't take interpreters in because of the legislation. You've got to have a right of entry permit to enter workplaces. So, you know, this is how bad it is. The handler in some other places, they are inside the workplace with the workers. So, you know, a bit like watching them work. Now, in particular, we hear stories, in particular about the Chinese, whether they're true or not, you know, because we can't talk to them about how they have to borrow money to come, or whether they hold their families as guarantors. In particular, if they come from small villages in China, they will say to them, well, you know, if you don't do as you're told, you know, we will let the family know. It's just horrendous. I know I said I wouldn't talk much, but I'm talking a lot. So I'm sorry about that. The next one, I just wanted to touch on the Pacific Islanders. Now, there is, if that isn't slavery, modern day slavery, I don't know what it is. You know, they bring these people from very familial village structures, cultural backgrounds, probably faith-based. They take them, as Anthony said, in a bus. You know, they get off the airport. They don't even get to see the country. They get taken to some region in the back of Whoop Whoop. They're shoved in a house that usually the employer owns or some manager owns. They put 16, 20 people in a maybe 3-4 bedroom house. You know, they have to pay rent. They have to pay rent for the furniture. So, you know, if there's a bed, there's a sofa, there's a TV, there's a fridge, they have to pay for that. You know, and then because none of them have got licenses, the employer invests in buying a bus. So the bus comes around to your house, so you can't even say you're sick. It's bonded labour by any means. There's no infrastructure for these people when they're not working. There's nothing's given to them. And it's just, they take advantage of them because, yes, when you think about even if they underpay them the wages compared to what they would earn in the communities, yes, it's probably a fortune. And they do this because they think, what, if I go there for 3 years, I can go back to my country or my community and I can help and I'll do it. But it's not right, it's not right on so many levels. And I think there's a whole heap of the supply chain needs to look at it and say, from the farm to the customer, to the end product where you buy it in a supermarket, we're all responsible for this. No one can say that they're not responsible. And everybody knows it's happening because we have really publicised this. There's been shows on Four Corners and stuff like that about what they do. But there's not a lot of appetite to fix it, because the processes have been very successful in convincing governments that people don't want to work in our industry. I can guarantee people will work in our industry. They just want to work for proper wages and terms and conditions. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks for that overview, Patricia. I might put to your question just related to what you've just been talking about. I know we said we'd do Q&A later, but I think it might be helpful if you explain this. Tim Diamond has asked, Patricia, I might have missed this. Who is the handler actually employed by? And on what basis is the handler in the workplace at all?
Well, an extremely good question. Well, we assume the handler is either somebody that lives in Australia that has got a connection to the labour hire in that country, or they come with them. I don't, and we don't, as I said, we can ask these questions of the handler, but they don't answer, they'll just look at you and smile and stuff like that and say, but basically, how they get into, that's a really good question, because we can't get anybody into the industry, yet these people come, they don't do any work at all. They're just what we call handlers. They're just overseers to ensure that everyone's, in our opinion, what they're there to do, everybody stays in line, nobody deviates from it, everyone's working, nobody's talking to each other, nobody's saying, things. I mean, I don't know what else to call it, but, they're handlers. They handle the workers in order to make sure that there's a smooth thing and nobody's deviating from that position. Yeah,
it sounds very much like, I didn't come across that term during the inquiry I mentioned. What we talked about and saw were what we called rogue third-party contractors. So that is, as opposed to a reputable labour hire agency that a farm or a meatworks might contract with for the provision of the workers, in some instances in accordance with workplace laws, you had these sort of under the radar operators who were just a conduit, really. And I guess, the intention of the licensing schemes that have emerged in the last few years has been to try and wipe them out of the market. So basically say that if you're in any way involved in third-party provision of labour to another business, then you've got to meet certain standards in order to be licensed. And also saying to the host, whether it's meatworks or a farm, you can't use somebody to provide services unless you're engaging with a licensed operator. Do you have any sense whether licensing has helped in relation to that?
Well, we don't have licensing laws in New South Wales.
Yes, of course.
We don't have them, so therefore it's a free for all. We certainly have been pushing the federal government to introduce national laws. But look, I'll give you what my experience is with labour hire is, and I know that in Queensland when they introduced the labour licensing, they did do some prosecutions, and that's really good. But the problem is that they go away. Yes, I'll cop a fine or whatever. They'll just re-emerge somewhere else. the business model is extremely lucrative. So therefore, there is an enticement there for the provisional labour. Now, we believe that once the Labor government's same job, same pay legislation comes into force, that this may very well see the diminishing of labour hire, because there'll be no real incentive to provide labour at a lower cost, which is what they do now. So you have two lots of workers working beside each other. One earns this money, the other one earns less.
All right, and that's another very important, significant reform that is ahead of us, that's tackling some of these problems from another different perspective as well. There's just a comment from Ros Robinson, Patricia, who says that it's a great oversight and she'd value a conversation with you. She advocates for palm scheme workers in the Riverina, so we'll put two of you in touch.
Absolutely. Look, if you Google AMIU New South Wales branch, all my details are there. My email, my mobile's there, so feel free to call me. Yep.
Excellent. No worries. All right. Well, we might move on then to you, Shelley. So I think you're going to tell us about the key findings of the report, and the report is called "Where's the Beef? An Evaluation of Meat Company Modern Slavery Statements Over 2 Years." I mentioned earlier that you and Emma Moolchand are co-authors, along with Hannah Coffey and Sheridan McErvale. So over to you to just highlight the key aspects of the report that we're launching.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. You can see my PowerPoint. Great. So I am going to speak to the findings of our report. But before I do that, I just want to highlight some of the things that Patricia has shared with all of you. And really the narrative that I'm trying to build here is that there has been a wealth of evidence through many academic articles, through government inquiries, through Fair Work Ombudsman inquiries as well, that meant that the entire industry should have been put on notice about the conditions that meat workers and the modern slavery risks. So as Patricia has already outlined, there's a large proportion of the industry that are migrant workers, and that started in 1996 and has grown since then. Nearly 80% of meat processing takes place outside capital cities. And the reason for that is that it's good for it to be close to the livestock. That's healthier. It means that there's less distance for the livestock to travel. But the consequence of that is that workers are isolated and they're out of sight. And one of the conversations that Patricia and I have been having is, well, why, despite the fact that the evidence is on the public record, does there still seem to be so little attention paid to the conditions of meat workers? So I think, you know, there's a lot of talk and a lot of awareness, especially amongst large companies, about problems for workers in the horticultural industry. And although the conditions are very similar and the visa problems are very similar, we just haven't seen the same kind of awareness in the meat industry. And part of that is because it's really hidden. As Patricia said, it's very hard to get entry into a meat processing plant. So it's very difficult and kind of out of sight, I think. And the other reason we speculate is simply that it's somewhat abject. People don't want to talk about meat processing. It's something that we prefer to kind of put to one side. But despite that, there have been frequent reports about the serious concerns related to underpayment of wages, excessive long working hours, its casualisation, and as has already been described, the predominance of employment through labour hire with Phoenix activities. So that means the labour hire disappearing and popping up under another name. There have been recent visa changes, and that has resulted in less reliance on what were called 457 visas is now part of the temporary skill shortage visa. Less emphasis on that, greater reliance on temporary overseas workers, on holiday visas, and also, as Patricia and I were discussing this morning, overseas students, and then also on the Pacific Labour Scheme, which is now the temporary work international relations visa. And though hopefully there's some tightening of that, which under the Labour government, which will result in better outcomes. So just to kind of remind us of how these conditions occur, which do constitute bonded labour under international law. So a fantastic account can be found within the literature and case studies about workers who come from the Philippines. So generally a recruiter will advertise a job in the country of origin, or workers will be recruited because the recruiter goes to the site where workers are working. They observe the work, which counts as a trade test, and they carry out all the paperwork for the contract, relocation, visa applications, and so forth. Where the problem occurs is that the workers are required to pay upfront a placement fee and told that the rest will be deducted from their wages. Now, that is actually not allowed under the visa schemes, but it is common practice. So workers find themselves, once they've arrived in Australia, in a rural town, often in towns where the economy is very reliant on the meat works, generally employed through a labour hire agent, despite the changes in laws which have occurred lately, and carrying out very long shifts. And these long shifts make it very difficult for them to make contact with the local community, as well as language difficulties, which are really well documented in the literature. The employment is extremely fragmented, unusually so. So daily hire employment is common, and casual employment also. And as we've touched on already, meat processing is extremely hazardous, and that is one of the reasons why it was an incubator for COVID, and was covered actually for some time during COVID. It's extremely physically demanding. The temperatures are low in the main areas, absolutely freezing, -20 in some areas, and all of that meant that it was a real problem during COVID. So there have been numerous investigations that have brought to the notice, or ought to have brought to the notice of those who care about the conditions of workers. So the Fair Work Ombudsman's investigation into Baeda, there were some really shocking stories there. So to quote, Ms. Chang confirmed that even after paying $3,000 in Taiwan and then having to wait before they began an induction training, many of her friends also had to pay arrangements to an agent called Tim, another $1,000 to $2,000 to work in the meat factory. All of this is before they'd even begun employment. And so they effectively worked without pay for the first 4 weeks, and subsequently had their pay docked. Another report in ABC News about a Fiji worker who said that when he looked at his pay at the end of his first week, he'd only been paid $56. He said deductions for the week include $150 for accommodation, $105 for relocation costs for flights, visa processing and ground transport, and $50 to pay a cash advance on arrival. We saw our pay slip. I was so very sad. I really wanted to go back home when I saw my pay slip. But as Patricia said, people either can't go home because they wouldn't be able to afford to do it, or they feel as though they've already invested so much that it'd be really hard if they pull out now, they're going to be even further behind. The Senate Standing Committee on Education and Employment put the responsibility for this squarely with lead firms, saying one of the key issues that arose during the Senate inquiry was the accountability mechanisms that lead firms had in place to ensure that the workers being supplied to the lead firm by labour hire contractors were receiving the correct rates of pay. Many witnesses, including the regulator, identified cash payments and the failure to maintain accurate records as a major problem. So again and again, the Fair Work Ombudsman, the Senate, other inquiries say that big firms in supply chains need to be taking far more responsibility for the conditions of these workers. All of these factors that I've been speaking about today are either indicators of bonded labour or at least red flags of modern slavery. And that's the point I want to leave you with as I go into the findings of our Where's the Beef report. So we selected companies based on their association with the meat value chain across poultry, red meat, and at different stages. So meat processing, supermarkets and fast food chains, keeping in mind that companies that report under the Modern Slavery Act are very large. So we're not taking account of the actual processing plants or the labour hire agencies, the smaller players. This is the big players that the Senate has said bear responsibility here. We analysed using criteria that was developed by a large team of academics and civil society organisations, and there have been other reports that we published using that criteria, including paper promises and broken promises, but here we're just focusing on the meat sector. So what we find is that using that criteria, the average score is around 34% in terms of both compliance with the law and what they have to, the mandatory reporting requirements, and then further requirements, which I'm going to speak to in a moment. With Woolworths and Coles scoring highest, but still with a long way to go. In the second year, we see Woolworths dropping a little, with Coles being higher. So some change in from year to year, but I think what we found most disturbing is that instead of seeing improvements, which is what was anticipated by the regulators, instead we're actually seeing a decline in reporting with regards to meat sector risks. What we find is that companies are reporting on their compliance with procedures and regulations, but they're not really addressing the kind of concrete problems that we see in the industry. They're not providing information about their monitoring frameworks and metrics. They're talking in very general terms about risks. Very few companies identified the meat sector as an industry where there are risks of modern slavery. So you can see here that the red indicates that companies didn't identify any risk. Yellow is where they identified some risks, and green is where they had identified any risks. So we see that there is a recognition by some companies, a very small number, about the risks associated with the migrant workforce and temporary visas, but far less about the kind of systematic, or no recognition about the systematic downward cost pressures, which have been reported on frequently. So only 2 companies explicitly identified the meat sector of Australia as a high risk for modern slavery. Disturbingly, despite the constant reports that have occurred. So just to give you a couple of examples, Nolan Meats, this is their statement. It's only 1 page, and basically they just say we're complying with the law. This statement doesn't comply with the requirements under the Modern Slavery Act, and it looks to me like an indication of very little effort here. Woolworths, which has a far more extensive statement, says it aspires to lead in the fight against modern slavery through extensive disclosure. It showcases collaborations, not in relation to the meat industry, but in relation to other sectors. But it falls short of explicitly acknowledging its own role in the industry. It doesn't acknowledge the unequal dynamics intrinsic in the company's complicity. It doesn't acknowledge the downwards pressure on prices, which has been identified in government inquiries, who have put the onus on these companies to take more action. So our recommendations, well, I mean, the first thing is just simply to comply with the requirements under the Modern Slavery Act, which actually asked that there be consultation with all owned and controlled entities. Many of the entities that we looked at failed to identify all of the actors within their family of companies. Look at the way that the company's own operations and practices are contributing to risks. So what we wanted to see is some recognition of the way that the company's own purchasing practices are putting downwards pressure within the industry. Provide concrete case studies. The way that that the Modern Slavery Act is going to be effective is if we can learn from each other. If a company can provide a concrete case study about the way that it has worked with suppliers and with workers to address modern slavery risks, then we'll all be able to learn about best practice in the area. But there's a real absence of that kind of reporting. We saw far too much reliance on platforms like SEDEX that provide a percentage risk rather than a company carrying out its own investigation of its own supply chains. You know, these are Australian companies who have the capacity to go and look within their own supply chains to establish whether there are instances or risks of modern slavery or egregious labour rights abuses. They don't need to rely on a company to provide them a risk rating. To incorporate ethical purchasing practices and adopt a worker-centric approach by supporting freedom of association and working with the union to address problems. We know that worker voice makes a huge difference in addressing these kinds of risks. And there are really good examples where there have been strong partnerships, but not so much in the meat industry. Establishing a robust grievance mechanism. We really didn't see any evidence of grievance mechanisms within the Australian meat industry in relation to modern slavery. And I would say finally, because I've already touched on seeking feedback from impacted workers, finally, we really need to see far, far more sectoral collaboration. So there's such a concentration of power amongst retailers and the big buyers in this area. If they got together and addressed the problem of working conditions together, it would make such a massive difference. We will be making our report public after this. I'm going to email it to everybody who's joined us today. it'll soon be on the Business and Human Rights Centre's website as well. I really look forward to having a chat now.
Thanks very much, Shelley, for giving that fantastic overview, both of the context, you know, a lot of the long-standing problems in terms of the way in which workers are engaged and treated in this sector, which Patricia also touched on, but then using that to frame the really important research that you and your team have done that's reflected in the report. And you've also answered one of the queries about how people can get hold of it. So it will be distributed to those in attendance today after the session. So the questions are starting to come through. So I'll go back to one from, and we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions now. Back to the one from Tim Diamond. And I think you touched on this, Shelley, in terms of the intense competition in the sector. But Tim asks, does the change in the Woolworths score, I think it was over the 2-year period, coincide with the price war in the retail sector? And then Darren added, pertinently, that Woolies just posted a $1.62 billion profit. I think you might be muted, Shelley.
It had to happen at some point, didn't it?
At some point it did, yep.
Yeah. Great question, Tim. Thank you so much. I mean, so yes and no is the answer. So there's different dynamics within the red meat and poultry, and different states dominate in terms of those different kind of types of meat. So in red meat, we see a lot more meat being exported. And so the dynamics are less driven by the two big supermarkets, and yet we see the same practices. So I don't think that we can be blaming kind of the change necessarily on the price war. Yeah, but it's a great question. Yes, definitely a lot is being driven because of the price war. And yet, as Darren points out, there's a 1.62 billion profit for Woolies posted. Coles also has posted new profits, new heights. So yes, you know, I think it's being driven partly by a price war, but partly also by an expectation around the extent of profits. And also, I think because there's an acceptance broadly across the sector of these practices, with businesses reporting that, with meat processors reporting that if they comply with labour laws, then they're very unlikely to get contracts with the big players.
Excellent. And Darren's got a follow-up question, to which I have a follow-up question, but we'll start with what Darren asks. He says, thanks, Shelley and Patricia. Modern slavery in the meat industry is a major problem in many countries and has been for decades, centuries. Can you comment on how unions and other activist civil society organisations are campaigning on the global level? I don't know if you want to respond first, Patricia, or Shelley.
Well, it's a really, really good question. I mean, and I think Shelley touched on it. The problem with the meat industry is kind of operates under the radar because people eat meat, but they don't really want to engage with the sector, which is to the detriment, I think, you know, of the industry. You know, so I think there's a lot of that happening, and it's really hard to get a real handle on what really happens inside the meat industry. Also, don't forget it's an industry that has zoonotic diseases in the red meat part of it. So therefore, any person going into a meatworks must be inoculated against Q fever. You can't just go into a meatworks, you know, to have a look, unfortunately. So on a global level, the problem is that there is a food sector that's global. that we're part of here in Australia. We're part of that. But the food industry is so vast. So you have to think the food industry covers all types of food. There are meat sectors within those, but it's quite fragmented. There's no real, like, like I'll give an example of the Transport Federation and all of that. It's very tight, or the seafarers and all of those are very tight globally. The meat industry is very different in that respect. And also because even within the meat industry, as I said, you have red meat, cattle, buffalo, and all of that. You then got sheep. You then have goats, which is the most consumed meat in the world. You have camel production, you have wild animal production. You then move into the poultry sector, which, takes down to from ducks to quails, from turkeys all the way down to quails. We even process pigeons and things like that. So it's an enormous industry. It's not like, everybody's competing with each other for that market share. So getting together as an industry has always been very difficult. So it is a problem. As I said, when I travel, and I had the privilege of working overseas and having in America in particular, and having a look at the meat industry in America, and where I was, there was a lot of Mexican workers there, and I'm privileged to the fact that I'm a Spanish speaker, and I was able to speak to these workers who knew nothing about Q fever, who knew nothing about PPE, who knew nothing about their rights. So I was very shocked because, America being, the country that sets the standards for the meat industry, didn't, in the abattoirs that I saw, certainly did not apply those. But it is to the detriment of the industry. Look, I do everything I can, but I'm only one single voice to try and bring the meat industry into the forefront, for people not to be afraid to ask questions about the meat industry. We're a food producer. Well, that's what we do. We feed people. There's nothing to be afraid of about talking about the meat industry.
Thanks, Patricia.
Jump in if I can on that.
Yeah.
So one of the kind of positive things about the COVID pandemic is that some countries did change their laws in relation to, in particular, to try to address the problem of the kind of subcontracting that occurs. So Germany, for example, changed its law to address the problem of temporary workers, because really similar problems to what we see in Australia with immigrant temporary workers were occurring there and across the EU. There's the Danish model where they've really mechanized, and so workers are kind of highly skilled, but far less employers. So, the other thing that occurred during COVID, and it's here that Australia performed extremely badly. I mean, it's really, it's just a shame. But at least during COVID, there was far more social security provided to workers in other countries, whereas because so many of our workers are migrant workers, they weren't afforded the same kind of, JobKeeper, job seeker provisions. So people went through hardship when work wasn't available, although actually in most meat processing, demand went up rather than down during that period. So there are answers. We don't need to look all that far to look for good legal models, look for good organising techniques. But Australia hasn't started really yet in the meat sector.
Great, and I'll dispense with my question, building on the union question, because there's some other really good ones coming through. But it was really just to note that on page 30 of the report, there's a really good example of cooperative partnership between Coles, I'm not sure which union, but it had identified underpayment at a farm that was supplying to the supermarket, and then Coles worked with the relevant parties, including the union and the farm and the labour provider, to try and to in fact get a resolution in terms of recompense and ensuring those workers were back paid. So there are some good examples, it seems, of that kind of collaboration. But moving to the other great questions, I think this is again for you, Shelley, from just lost it. I think it's from Kate Grosser, the new co-director of Bright. Sorry, no, that's Kate's point about the recording being available. It's this one from Alexander Cowan. Thanks, Shelley. Have you seen possible good practices in the meat sector in countries overseas like the UK, which also has modern slavery legislation, that would be relevant for us to consider in Australia?
Thank you. Well, I've kind of just spoken to that a little bit. I have not seen good practice in the UK, and I think that one of the things that tells us is the Modern Slavery Act isn't acting as an impetus for change. And one of the reasons for that is because the monitoring of compliance with the Modern Slavery Act in Australia and the UK really relies on academics and civil society to carry out the kind of benchmarking that we're carrying out. So in neither country is there the capacity of a regulator to impose fines or any sanctions for non-compliance with the Act. So in the case of the meat sector, in case of the statements that we analysed, where they don't meet the mandatory requirements of the Act, there's nothing happens. I mean, all that happens is a seminar like this. There are no repercussions for companies. And to speak to Kate's question about incentives to business to improve, as a consequence, there's really no incentive for lead firms, those with the most power in supply chains, to change their practices unless there's greater pressure on them. So we may see fines imposed under the Modern Slavery Act, but that again will just be in terms of whether reporting is conducted accurately, and currently there isn't quite accurate reporting. But we certainly need to see more than that. So the kinds of enforceable agreements that the Fair Work Ombudsman has developed, may be effective in this area. I think we need to see far more enforceable undertakings of that kind. We need to see far more, well, I think, a change in the accessorial liability provisions under the Fair Work Act as well, which would allow for claims to be made higher up in the supply chain, for those lead firms to be made more responsible, because it's so difficult under Australian law at the moment. And again, there are some really good examples where that's working more effectively in other countries.
Fabulous. And that incorporated an answer. I knew there was a question there from Kate, so thank you for doing that, Shelley. The next one is from Hannah Tinyane. Again, for you, Shelley, I wonder if you could speak more about recommendation 4, where you suggest a balance of use of collaborative platforms like SEDEX with internal assessments. Do we know if companies have the capacity to do assessments internally?
Yeah. So, so maybe, and I apologise to SEDEX for singling them out here, but because they're the main platform which is being relied on for risk ratings, that's why we raise them. But there are other companies that are kind of providing that type of service. And I would say, in my own conversations with personnel from SEDEX, that they're really frustrated that actually all of the services that are provided even by SEDEX aren't being used. So SEDEX, for example, They do provide this kind of general risk rating of countries and sectors, and that's what most reporting entities are relying on. But any company that has a membership or gets their service can get far more detailed information. Now, I don't know whether companies are accessing that information, but they're not reporting on it because their PR, their comms team or their legal team look at this and say, actually, we don't want such a detailed report of the more concrete risks, or whether the people who are responsible for modern slavery statements or addressing these areas in companies just aren't being resourced to kind of spend the time and burrow down. Definitely some companies have already built the capacity to carry out internal assessments. And if they haven't, when a company is of the size, the ones that we looked at, they certainly have the capacity to build a team that could carry out those internal assessments, but they haven't done so. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, it gives them the capacity, this kind of willful ignorance, that they don't have the knowledge about the sector. They don't need to because there have been these practices of outsourcing. But we have seen good examples, again, within horticulture, where there has been far more work within companies to assess their supply chains. So it is possible, and it is being conducted by Australian companies, just not in the meat sector. And one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on the meat sector is because this is Australia. No, we're not talking about companies going to Brazil and carrying out an assessment of meat works there. We're talking about traveling within a state. Or talking to the union where they could get information, or using worker voice mechanisms where they could also get information. So at least something more could be done very, very easily if those lead firms wanted to.
Okay, well, I think we're approaching near the end of our time. I think we've got time for one more question, and apologies to a couple of people who that means will miss out on asking a question. But I think this one from Hannah Plum is a good one to perhaps use to get some final observations from both of you, Shelley and Patricia. And Hannah says, do you know if the Australian meat industry is moving towards any voluntary commitments on responsible recruitment of migrant workers? I know Woolworths is a member of the Consumer Goods Forum, but I'm wondering if there are any discussions happening at the Australian level.
Patricia, I'll leave that one for you.
Yeah, we've had some success since the change of government at a national level, and we're getting much change in regards to palm workers and FIP workers, you know, for people from the Pacific Island and Fiji and all of that. So we are getting some control. Tomorrow, for instance, there's a cohort of them arriving in one of our abattoirs, and our organiser will be there to do inductions. So we'll get a chance to talk to them and give them information about their rights, check to make sure that they've had Q fever inoculations and stuff like that. So well, that's changing. But look, in everything I heard today, I think for this to change, there has to be a huge change at a national level to say temporary migration, when it supplements labour, is where the problem is. What we should be saying is, if we need to bring people into this country, then they should come with the right to be residents and eventually citizens, and afforded all the rights that everyone's given. The minute you make somebody come to this country under precarious situations, inevitably people will use that situation in order to exploit them. And the other thing I'd like to say is that if you went out and you did a poll outside, you walked around the streets and you said to people, do you think there's modern slavery here in Australia? I'd guarantee that 99.9% of the people would go, no way. There's no way that we have slaves in this country. That's rubbish. I think people don't understand what it means, you know, and I try to say to people, just because you pay them doesn't mean they're not slaves. you know, and you need to just change your focus. But it is hard to cut across. And if you even ask the workers that come from overseas, do you think you're a slave? They would probably say, no, I'm not. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's a perception there that we need to overcome as well in order to make change. Until we get the message across and the public changes its position, you're probably not going to get a lot of change. And there was a question there about how when you go to the supermarket, you're made to feel guilty about the farmers. And that's very true. And the farmers have been extremely good at lobbying. I'm not saying that they're wrong in their lobbying, but they've been really good at getting a message out to the consumer about how tough they have to do it. However, from there to when you buy the product, there's been very little, you know, very little stuff about how people understand the industry. So I commend what you guys are doing. Any light that can be thrown on the meat industry, good, bad, or indifferent, is good for the industry.
Fabulous way to finish. Thank you so much, Patricia. Just reinforcing the need for the research that Shelley and her team have done. In closing, I hereby launch the report and congratulate the research team on their excellent work, and Shelley for explaining it so clearly today. And thank you all very much to all the participants for attending and for your fantastic engagement through the Q&A. And just in closing, a reminder that the Business and Human Rights Centre at RMIT does commissioned research, runs training, and provides advice. And if you're interested in engaging with the centre in relation to any of those of its activities, you can contact its new directors, Dr. Kate Grosser and Dr. Jonathan Coleb. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. See you.
Thanks, everyone.